I want to begin by giving you some reasons why we can know God exists. There are many of them, but I'm going to lay out some this evening. And the first one I want to lay out is it's become a very famous argument now. And this is an argument that is sometimes given a fancy name called the Kalam cosmological argument. That's the name of it. But the argument basically goes like this. It says that the universe exists now. We actually have a universe that exists right now. Here we are. The universe either had a beginning or there was no beginning. Notice that this is an exhaustive dilemma. There's no middle ground. Everybody's going to have to end up in one or two of those groups. That's everybody. You have to pick a side on that. Now, the argument tries to show that that's not true, but that it's true that the universe had a beginning. Well, if the universe had a beginning, the beginning was either caused or it was uncaused. Note again, this appears to be another exhaustive dilemma. One is just the negation of the other. One of these has got to be true. There's no third ground. The argument tries to show that this option is not the case, and that the universe, in fact, was caused. The beginning of the universe was caused. If the beginning of the universe was caused, it was either caused by something personal, or it was caused by something impersonal. And the argument tries to show that there was a personal cause for the beginning of the universe. There was a personal cause for the beginning of the universe. Now, let me give you 3 reasons to believe the universe began to exist. Let's start through this argument. This is the argument. And the first piece of evidence is that the universe that we live in had a beginning. By the universe, I don't mean anything persnickety at this point. By the universe, I just mean the sum total of space, time, and matter. That will do for our purposes. So the universe is the sum total of space, time, and matter. Now, the idea here is that this universe began to exist. And the first piece of evidence for the beginning of the universe is a philosophical argument. It's called in philosophy an a priori argument. It doesn't depend upon the senses. It's a philosophical argument that the universe had a beginning. This argument was known all the way back before the time of Christ, so it's been around a long time. And the argument basically it turns on the idea that it's impossible to cross infinity. Nothing could cross infinity. Now, infinity is infinitely larger than any finite number. In fact, we could show that infinity plus or minus any number is infinity. So if you take infinity and subtract 50 from it, you still got infinity. If you take infinity and add 50 quadrillion zillion, you still have infinity. Now, it's impossible to cross infinity. To illustrate this, suppose that I went to heaven and God said to me, "Moreland, it's good to have you here. You're a good guy. You loved my son Jesus, but some of those lectures you gave were pretty weak. And so I've got an assignment for you. I want you to begin counting the natural numbers now forever. Get started." So I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, and I get up to 50 quadrillion zillion. And another guy dies, and he's given the same assignment. And the poor guy is up to the number 75. And I'm up at 50 quadrillion zillion. And I look over at this guy smugly and think to myself, "You poor sucker, you are way behind me." Until it dawns on me, we both have the same number of numbers left to count. An infinite number. I've made absolutely no progress. Because no matter how far I count, I still have the same number of numbers to count, an infinite number. So I'm not really ahead of the guy. We both have the same number of numbers left to count, and my head explodes. That's because it's impossible to cross infinity. Now, if you can't go from 0 to positive infinity, you can't cross from minus infinity to 0. It's the same, because it's the same distance. Now, so let's suppose that this is time, and this is the present moment right now. And we'll just freeze this present second at 0. Let's suppose that this is a year ago, this is minus 50,000 years ago, this is minus 50 billion years ago, this is minus 50 quadrillion, and so on. Now, if the universe never had a beginning, how far back does this line go? Is there an edge on it? If there were an edge, what would that be? If there were an edge on this, what would that be? That would be the beginning, wouldn't it? So there's no edge, is there? This literally goes, not whatever, but forever. Okay? It goes for infinity. And this is the symbol for infinity. This goes to minus infinity. Now, if you can't cross infinity, if the universe never began to exist, this present moment could have never been reached. Because in order for the universe to reach this present moment, it would have to have unfolded through an infinite number of earlier moments, which is impossible. Now, just think about it again. If it's impossible to cross infinity, then the universe, in order to reach now, had to go through yesterday, and the day before that, and the day before that. And that means that in order for the universe to reach the present moment, it had to run through all the earlier moments that have already happened to get here right now. If the universe never had a beginning, that means in order to reach 0, the present moment, the universe would have to go from minus infinity to 0, and that's impossible. Even God himself can't cross infinity. And I'll explain in a little bit why that's true. But this is even something impossible for God to do. Now, some may be thinking, well, nothing's impossible with God. Not true. Not true. God, for example, it's impossible for him to lie, the Bible says. Secondly, it says it's impossible for him to swear by a name greater than himself. It's also impossible for him to cease to exist. There are a lot of things God can't do. There are things I can do he can't do. For example, he can't run a 100-yard dash. Now, the reason he can't is because he's already at the finish line. Another thing that I can do that God can't do is grow in knowledge or grow in character. I can do that and God can't. Now, of course, God doesn't need to because he's already got completely perfect character. So he doesn't need to grow in character. But the point is that God can't cross infinity. Nothing can cross infinity. What that tells us is that the universe had to have a beginning, and there was an edge to the start of the universe. That's what that tells us. Now, the universe then began to exist. In the 1800s, scientists discovered something called entropy, or the second law of thermodynamics. And this is the second reason that we know the universe had a beginning. Scientists discovered that there is a thing called useful energy, and that the universe is using up its useful energy. It's burning up its entropy, or its useful energy. Now, Lord Kelvin, who was one of the original thermodynamicists, saw immediately that this implied that the universe began to exist. And here was his reasoning. On this view, the universe, if it's running out of its energy, is eventually going to use up all of its useful energy. In fact, Time magazine years ago, 6-7 years ago, had a cover story, and the title of the story was How the Universe is Going to End. And it said that there's eventually going to be a day that will come in the future when, number one, all the lights are going to go out. There won't be any light anywhere. Number two, there will be no more heat. Everything will reach absolute zero. 3, there will be no motion, because every atom and every subatomic particle will be billions of miles away from every other atom and subatomic particle, and things will reach a standstill and then there will no longer be any motion. Because the universe is using up its useful energy. Now, the problem is then, the universe is like a tank of gasoline. And if you saw a car that had a tank of gas in it and you knew it couldn't get refilled and it was moving and still had fuel in it, you would know that that car hadn't been being driven for 75 years. Good grief, you'd know that it probably hadn't been driven more than 20 hours or 10. But certainly 75. One thing you'd know for sure is the car couldn't have been being driven for infinity, right? Because if the car had been being driven that long, what would have already happened to it? It would have already used up all of it. It would have run out of gas. Yeah, that's right. It would have already used up its useful fuel. Since the universe hasn't used up its useful fuel yet, it follows that it hasn't been here forever. It follows that the past has to be finite in duration, and that at the beginning of the universe there was a certain amount of useful fuel put into the universe, and since that time it's been being used up steadily. That's the picture that emerges. So the second law of thermodynamics provides confirming evidence from science for an argument that we've known for a long time from philosophy. The third piece of evidence from science, and this may be controversial among you, it's called the Big Bang Theory. The Big Bang Theory is controversial among Christians, but the simple fact of the matter is that if the Big Bang Theory is true, then it implies that the universe began to exist. Because the Big Bang Theory teaches that all of the galaxies are expanding away from one another as time goes on. They're accelerating away from one another, and if you extrapolate back, you reach a point where the universe comes into existence out of something that is as good as nothing. Comes into existence out of nothing. And so we have 3 lines of evidence that the universe began to exist. I do not accept the beginning of the universe as an item of faith. I believe it's something we now know to be true. Why? Because number 1, it's impossible to cross infinity. And if the universe never began to exist, the present moment could have never showed up. B, the second law of thermodynamics tells us the universe is using up its useful energy, and eventually it will use it all up. Since it hasn't done that yet, it could not have been here forever. It had to have a beginning. And 3, the standard Big Bang model, which is still, I think, the most widely accepted model, implies that space, time, and matter sprang into existence out of nothing something like 13.5 billion years ago. All of these imply that there was a beginning. And so for these reasons, then, I take it to be the case that there was, in fact, a beginning to the universe. It has not been here forever. And that raises the question, was the beginning of the universe caused to exist, or did the universe pop into existence out of nothing without a cause? Now, the idea that something could come into existence from nothing without a cause is, in my view, incoherent. I have no idea what it even means to say something could pop into existence out of nothing without a cause. Think of it. If this were the case, if things like that could happen, then a goat could just appear, or the Empire State Building, or a sour prune, or whatever it might be. Things could just pop into existence out of nothing without any cause whatsoever. So the problem is that the universe, the idea that the universe could pop into existence out of nothing without any cause whatsoever is an idea for which that barely seems intelligible. The very idea of something coming from nothing seems incoherent. If I said the cake came from eggs and flour, then what we have to have are eggs and flour for the cake to come from it. But you can't have something coming from nothing, or you're not treating nothing like nothing. You're treating nothing like something. And if there's anything I know about nothing, that is that it's nothing. Okay. Now, thank you. I see that hand. Now, so the point is that the very idea that the universe could come into existence from nothing seems to me to be conceptually impossible. There is also no scientific evidence for it. There's no evidence whatsoever that something can come into existence out of nothing. Now, bless his heart, Stephen Hawking, who is a good scientist but a really, really bad philosopher, wrote a book recently where he claimed that the universe could, in fact, come into existence out of nothing. And then you take a look at his book, and what he's really claiming is that the universe could come into existence out of a quantum vacuum. Now, we don't need to talk about what a quantum vacuum is. The point is it's not nothing. It's actually a physical thing that's real. So when Hawking talks about the universe coming into existence out of nothing, he ain't talking about the universe coming into existence out of nothing. He's talking about the universe coming into existence out of something very specific, namely a quantum vacuum. That's a very, very different sort of thing. So I submit to you that there's never been any evidence of something coming into existence out of sheer nothing. Now, you know uranium can decay into lead. Okay? If you have uranium, it will decay eventually into lead. But that's not a case of getting lead out of nothing. That's a case where you get one thing transitioning into something else. So there is no evidence that anything has ever come into existence out of nothing without a cause. And indeed, the very idea seems incoherent. It seems much more plausible that if the universe came into existence, there had to be something to cause it to come into existence. Now, somebody might raise the question, well, if something caused the beginning of the universe, what caused God? Now, the problem is that the question, what caused God, is what philosophers call a category fallacy. It's a mistaken freshman logic, is what it is. The question, who caused or what caused God, is like the question, how many inches long is the note C? Or what is the smell of the color red? Those are category fallacies. When you ask a question like, how many inches long is the note C, or what does the note C weigh, you're applying the wrong category, weight, for example, to notes that don't have weight. So there's there's a confusion about the question. Now, the question, what made X? What made X? Who or what made X? Fill in the blank, whatever X is. You can only ask that question of X's that are by definition makeable things. So I could ask what made the planet Earth, because the Earth is something that could be made. I could ask, what made that tree, or who made the bread that's on sale out there, or who made the book, or something of that sort. Those are perfectly legitimate questions, because bread and trees and planets and books are by definition makeable kinds of things. But God, by definition, is the unmakeable creator of everything. Now, I'm not defining God into existence. Maybe there isn't a God at this stage of the argument. But at least when atheists and believers debate the existence of God, they agree with what they mean by God. Namely, God is the maker of heaven and earth, who is himself unmakeable. He is the uncreatable creator of everything else. Are you with me on that? But all the major world's religions mean that by God, and so do atheists. When they say there is no God, that's what they mean by God. So we all agree for the most part on what God means. The difference is whether there is one. Now, given that God, the very concept of God is an uncreatable creator of everything, the question, who made God, turns out then to be this question. Who was it that made something which by definition is unmakeable? Well, how can you ask the question of what made something that is by definition unmakeable? That's an incoherent question. I'm not getting a whole lot of nonverbal feedback from you. I don't know if I'm shooting over your head or you're tired, but I'm getting a lot of blank stares. Did that make any sense at all? You can't ask the question, what made something that is by definition unmakeable? Because that's asking, what made an unmakeable thing? That's like, how many square circles are sitting in the sanctuary? I mean, it's a contradictory question. Now, is that definition of God arbitrary? Did Christians just, grab that out of thin air? No, it's not an arbitrary definition of God, and I'll explain to you why. Suppose we have a person A here, and he wants to borrow an iPod. And so he goes to person B and says to B, may I borrow your iPod? And B says, I'd love to loan it to you. I don't have an iPod, but I'll go borrow one from a friend and I'll loan it to you. So B goes to C and says, I've got a friend A who needs an iPod. May I borrow yours? And C says, no problem. I don't have an iPod, but I will go borrow one from my friend D and I'll loan it to you and you can loan it to A. So this sorry business ends up going on, and the problem is that every member in the series here is a borrowing lender. That is to say, nobody has an iPod. Everybody can lend an iPod only if they first borrow one. You with me? Now, if we keep adding borrowing lenders, we can do that forever, and poor old A here is never going to get an iPod. If we just keep adding more borrowing lenders. What we're going to have to do is to stop this sorry mess with something that's different, and this is going to have to be an owning lender who simply has an iPod that he didn't have to borrow first. Maybe he made it, who knows? But he owns one and he didn't borrow it. You with me? Now, if that happens, he can give it to him, and pretty soon he'll get an iPod. Now, instead of iPods, let's ask about borrowing existence. Here, A is a thing that had to have existence given to it, like I had existence given to me by my parents. So A gets existence from B, but B can't give existence to A unless B already exists, and B has to get its existence from something else, but that thing can't give B existence unless it already exists, so it's got to borrow from D, and what you have are borrowing lenders of existence. Nothing will exist if you don't stop with a self-existent being. That is, a being that simply exists in itself and didn't borrow it from someone else. Okay? That kind of being is what philosophers call a necessary being. That kind of being doesn't borrow existence from something. That kind of being has it in himself or itself. Therefore, that sort of being cannot not exist, because existence was never given to it in the first place. And it can't lose what it was never given. So the idea of God being the uncreated creator is simply the idea of God being a non-borrowing lender of existence, and it makes perfect sense. Now, I believe then that the universe had to have something to cause it to begin to exist. And so now what we have to ask ourselves is, what is this thing that caused the beginning of the universe? Because here's what we've got. We got the present moment, and then we've got a beginning to time, however long ago that was. This is the beginning. And we have something that caused this to come into existence. Now, what do we know about this thing? Well, it turns out there are certain things we know about it. Number one, it is timeless. It created time, and it was capable of existing, therefore, without time, since it was able to create time. It's spaceless. It is immaterial. Again, because it created space, time, and matter, it was capable of existing before it created these things, since these are created things. It is supernatural. Now, what do I mean by supernatural? Here's what I mean by it. Not subject to the laws of nature. Not subject to the laws of nature. How do we know that? Well, because this being created the universe along with its laws of nature. And thus it has to be able to transcend the very thing it created. And so it's not subject to the laws of nature. Finally, this being had to have the power of free will. Now, I'm going to close with this point. I'll make this point, and then I'm going to draw out an implication for you. Then we'll have a little time of Q&A, and then we'll close the first session. But let me just explain something to you now. There's a difference between a free choice and a choice that is completely determined by things prior to when I choose. Suppose that my arm going up right now is determined by things before I choose. You understand? That means that just the moment before I raise my arm, something caused me to do so in a deterministic fashion. So if my arm going up was determined, something before I raised my arm made me do it. Okay? That means that if an act is determined, then there had to be a cause of that act that exists before it happened. An illustration. Suppose a mad scientist put an electrode in my brain, went across the street, and he could type in his keyboard any commands and make me do anything he wanted me to do. So I get up and walk down the street, and there's a guest, or there's a stranger going to walk past me on the sidewalk. This scientist is watching this from across the street. He wants to make sure that stranger gets popped in the mouth. And so he hits keyboard, hit stranger, enter. That causes an electrical jolt to occur in that chip in my brain, and that goes down my nervous system, and my arm flings out and hits him. Now that wasn't a free action on my part. I'm sorry. My act was determined by the scientist who had control of my body through his keyboard. Do you understand that? Now, the moment before my arm went up, something had to happen to me to determine that that happened. And what was it? It was the scientist hitting that keyboard, causing that electrical chip to move. Does that make sense to you? So whenever something is determined to happen, like my arm going up in that case, there has to be a cause, the scientist hitting the keyboard, that occurs just before the event happens. Does that make sense to you? You can't get a universe coming into existence like that. No scientific cause, no deterministic cause can explain the origin of the universe. Why? Because if the beginning of the universe was determined by something prior to the universe beginning, you'd have to have that determining event take place a moment before the time began. But the problem is there are no moments before time began. So you can't have something happening in time before time begins. Yeah. You can't have something going on earlier than. Now God, fortunately, doesn't even exist back here, because there is no back. He doesn't exist before time. He exists outside of time. So the reason God doesn't have to cross infinity is because he's timeless, without the universe at least. And so God is not subject to time without the universe. But now there is one exception to this rule of the cause having to exist before the effect. And that's whenever a person acts freely. if I spontaneously raise my arm and simply choose to raise my arm, and it's a free action, nothing that happened before that act determined that it take place. I simply had the power of will to raise my arm or to refrain from raising my arm. It follows then that if I raise my arm freely, nothing that was going on before I raised it determined that I raise it. And it was only what I chose to do freely at the very instant of moving my arm that has anything to do with my arm going up on the free will view. Yet that means the only way that you're going to get a beginning of time is if the being that caused the beginning of time had the power to simply will the universe to begin without anything happening earlier than him willing it to begin to cause him to do it. He had to have free will. He had to have the power to will the universe into existence. Now, there's one other characteristic that I want to give of this person, then I want to draw an implication, and we'll have some Q&A. Things with free will have minds and emotions. In fact, emotions move the will. They give it a motive for acting, and the mind gives direction to how it acts. Like I might freely choose to go to the store. Maybe I'm moved by a desire to want to help my wife, so that feeling moved me, didn't determine me, but it influenced me. And I chose to go to the store, and my choice was to go to the store. That means that free actions don't occur without there being thoughts and emotions in the neighborhood. But this is a supernatural person. It's not the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. It could be Allah for all we know at this point. And we'll talk about that on Sunday morning as to why Jesus. But at this point, what we have is a creator God. We have a God who exists that is the creator of the universe. Now, I want to make an application here. Then we'll take some questions, and then I'll recommend some resources for you, and we'll go until this evening where I want to cover more arguments in a briefer period of time. Here's the implication. Behind this physical world that you can see, touch, taste, smell, or hear is a huge, powerful, invisible spirit who was the being who brought this world into existence. He is not visible. He's a spirit. He's personal. He was the one who brought the world into being and continues to hold it into existence. The question that we should be asking at this point is whether or not there's any further evidence about this being and whether he has ever communicated to the human race. And eventually I'm going to suggest that we have a decisive answer to that question when it comes to the life of the career of Israel and culminating in the life and the deeds of Jesus of Nazareth. But this is one of the first piece of evidences for God's existence that Anthony Flew thought was a powerful argument.
Thank you for all your explanations.
You're welcome, sir.
I'm still stuck on impersonal and personal.
Okay.
Why couldn't it be impersonal?
Okay. Thank you. Question is, why couldn't it be impersonal? Whenever something impersonal causes an effect that's impersonal, and let's just think of an example. A flash of lightning causes a tree to split. Or an electron bumps into another electron. Or the wind knocks a leaf off a tree. Those are examples of where an impersonal cause produces an impersonal effect. Does that make sense to you? These are when you study impersonal cause and effect, this is called in philosophy event causation. That's the name for it. Event. And it's called that because the effect is an event and the cause is an event. So let's go back and think about it. The cause is the flash of lightning, and the effect is the splitting of the tree. The cause is the moving of the wind, and the effect is the falling of the leaf. The cause is the moving of the first electron making contact with the second, and the effect is the moving of the second electron. Now, these, every case of impersonal causation, then, we have an event that causes a subsequent event according to a law of nature. And these are connected together by a law of nature. Perhaps a law of chemistry or a law of meteorology or something of that sort. Now, notice that if this kind of cause and effect is one we're considering, the cause has got to exist in time before the event occurs, just prior to the event. The reason that won't work with the beginning is because there is nothing prior to the effect. There's no time before the effect event for event causation to get going. Because what you have is an effect, the effect event, namely the beginning of the universe, but there's no earlier time for the causal event to occur. So the problem is that impersonal cause-event sequences are examples of where earlier events cause later events, which then cause later events, which cause later events, and that whole shooting match presupposes time before it can work. You can't, therefore, apply that to the origin of time, because impersonal causes have already got to have time before they can operate.
Stephen Hawking described the origin of the universe in the question of what happened before, like what's on the other side of the North Pole.
Right.
I don't completely understand.
Yeah.
I get that from atheists. How would you respond to that?
Well, again, it's another example of freshman philosophy. The claim is that how can you talk about what happened before the beginning of the universe? That's like asking what's north of the North Pole. Okay. You can't ask what's north of the North Pole, right? Because that's like asking what is further in space north of the furthest place in space. That's north. So you can't ask what's north of the North Pole because north is the furthest place north in space. Okay? Similarly, you can't ask what is temporally prior to the first event because there is no time before the first event. So if I'm asking what was going on before the first event, you with me? If I ask what was going on before the first event, and if the word before means temporally earlier than, then it's a crazy statement. You can't even talk about what happened before the first event because there was no before. In terms of temporally earlier than. Does that make sense to you? So they're right if that's the only notion of before that we've got going, and namely temporally earlier than, but it's not. The term before can mean ontologically prior to. So there's another use of the term before, which means ontologically, sorry to get technical here, ontologically prior to, where if A is ontologically prior to B, then B owes its existence to A, but not conversely. Now, let me give you an example of a case where you've got ontological priority between two things, but not temporal priority. Let me give you an example. God says, let there be a couch with a bowling ball sitting on it. And instantaneously, a couch and a bowling ball sitting on that couch appears. Now, you've got three things going. You got the couch and the bowling ball, and you have a sunken depression in the couch. You with me? The bowling ball is ontologically prior to the sunken depression in the couch. That means that the bowling ball doesn't owe its existence to that sunken place in the couch, but the sunken place in the couch does owe its existence to the bowling ball, but one wasn't earlier than the other. So that the relationship between the two is not temporal priority, it's ontological priority. And so Hawking doesn't have any concept of ontological priority. So we can ask the question, what was ontologically prior to the first event, and not mean by that what was temporally earlier to the first event. Ontological priority just means what existed that the first event owed its existence on, but it didn't owe its existence on the first event. And that being could be timeless, doesn't have to be earlier than. That's the problem with the claim.